Emma Frame here, and welcome to Voices of Yoga podcast, co-hosted with Lindsay Porter, where we bring you inspiring yoga stories and insights from yogis and teachers from around the world. These stories highlight the benefits of yoga and encourage those who maybe haven't started yoga yet to get started, and for the more experienced to delve deeper. We hope you enjoy. This is podcast number 149 and video podcast number 15. Get started. So today I'm absolutely delighted to have on the show Joanne Avison, and Joanne is a yoga teacher, a yoga trainer, an author. Her book is Yoga, Fascia, Anatomy and Movement, and is also an applied anatomy and fascia expert. So very welcome to the show, Joanne.
Thank you for having me, Emma.
So on Voices of Yoga, we have briefly spoken about the fact that we love to use the sharing of a personal yoga story, how it came into your life, to inspire others to maybe get started if they haven't already, and also to give the benefits that people might not know about. So Joanne, can you tell us a bit about your yoga story?
Yeah, I came to yoga by accident, really. I was a young mother. I was 33 when my son was born. I put on an enormous amount of weight when I was pregnant. Couldn't get pregnant for years, didn't think I was ever going to get pregnant. And then I actually caught pneumonia. I was quite ill and came back from Singapore and was put into hospital for a week. And we think that somehow inadvertently, maybe that massive dose of steroids and nebulizers, I couldn't breathe, I was in a real pickle, somehow cleared something. I don't know whether it was physical, emotional, or a bit of everything. I suspect the latter. And my husband, who's not my husband anymore, but he's my son's father, and I love him very much, we had decided that if we couldn't have kids, we would learn to sail and sail around the world. And we'd learned a little bit about sailing, and we had a little boat, and we just invested our future into something a bit bigger that would, he thought, take us around Cape Horn. Oh God,
right.
I need to think about it. But anyway, and sailing's not my natural thing at all. I'm not great on the water, but I had to kind of learn that. And the night we put that boat in the water, the night we'd saved up all our pennies and got this beautiful 9-berth creature into the water, I went home. He stayed on the boat, and I discovered that night I was pregnant.
Wow.
And we were both in complete shock. So we'd planned a different life, and it wasn't happening. It's like, but I also wasn't physically geared, and to suddenly put on masses of weight. And again, I've subsequently learned that they think that the steroids that perhaps helped the situation also meant that my body went into a kind of shock. And I was euphoric. I must tell you, I was completely euphoric. But I ate and ate and ate and ate and ate, and I was very overweight. And when my son was born, I struggled to lift the little car seats we used to use, to put them in the front seat and strap them in. And I couldn't move. My back was killing me, and I couldn't move the seat into the car. So the pregnancy had kind of combination of the whole process and possibly the stress of trying to run our business. We were chocolatiers, and
gosh,
that's another whole story, but it's very relevant, but we'll get to that possibly. And cut a long story very short, I went to physiotherapy, and they laid me on a bed, wrapped my hips and ribs in a band, and then very slowly stretched my spine. Okay. And I can honestly tell you, second possibly to the peak of labor, I've never been in so much pain in all my life.
In that process, that treatment.
I do not condone it, and I know far too much about the human body now to ever condone that particular treatment. It's actually part of torture in medieval times.
Yes.
Like being put on a rack. And sorry if I'm offending any physios out there, but it's not necessary, nor would it be acceptable to me now. But I say that from the wisdom of somebody who's spent 20 years as a structural integration practitioner and a yoga therapist and so on. So another thing. What I'm saying is, not aren't I clever, but I'm clever enough to know now that was probably what drove me to find out, and I have the privilege of teaching human dissection. So I've actually seen that you can't body doesn't respond like that. The body has something in it called the Monosynaptic Reflex Arc. And that what that basically does is, you know, when you're sitting in a car or on a train and you nod off and suddenly you go like that, it's a built-in reflex that means that when we pull it too far in the wrong direction, it pulls itself back. It's a very intelligent system, and our tissue is that intelligent. I didn't know any of that then. I just wanted to be able to move my son. And I went to a therapist who said, you need to do yoga, you need to calm everything down, you need to soften everything, you need to relax. And I began to study yoga.
Okay.
And it transformed me. But I also learned the hard way because I'm hypermobile. See how my...
Oh my goodness.
So I discovered that I was really good at yoga because I could fold myself in half without even thinking about it. And then I discovered the problems of being hypermobile. If you lengthen into or lean into or overwork the focus on stretching that yoga sometimes is biased to, and you're hypermobile, you can actually form, if there's laxity in the tissue, it gets overlaxed. So that's a whole story. I mean, those are whole training programs in those two sentences. But suffice to say, John Stirk was one of my early teachers, and thank God for him, because he taught me to hold back. He went, no, just because you can fold in half doesn't mean you should. And he taught me to hold back and listen to my tissue. And through yoga and through the breathing and through actually slowing down in my case, because I was trying to do mummy and job and life and yoga all at the same time. 7 into 2 doesn't actually go very well, but I worked it out, and yoga saved my life. And then, as I was telling you before, subsequently, once I'd become a yoga practitioner, I think saved my father's.
Yes, and I would love you to share that story, because I really feel that that's got real significance there, if you wouldn't mind.
No, not at all, Emma. So where that story comes in is that when I was 8 years old, my father had mumps. And he was very depressed, and he was very overwhelmed as a young man in his 30s. And he had been a pilot, and he'd gone into, his mother became ill, and he'd gone into engineering because he couldn't leave to stay in the RAF and develop his love and passion for flying. And he was an engineer, and he, at this age, what was I, 8 years old, so we're talking 1968, he had what was then called a nervous breakdown. Mm-hmm. And he became very depressed. And what they did in those days, they treated depression with electric shock treatment.
Gosh.
Yeah. And all I remember as an 8-year-old was that Christmas, Daddy couldn't remember Christmas.
Gosh, how sad.
Yeah. And what we didn't know then, and found out over the subsequent 3 to 5 years, was that he was actually bipolar. And again, it wasn't, I don't know if this makes sense, but in those days, it wasn't something, we didn't have the Duke and Duchess of Sussex and the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge out there talking about mental health like it was a thing. It was not. And as I said to you before, as an 11, 12-year-old going into school, learning to debate, I would bring up subjects like, if my dad had a broken leg and was in a wheelchair and you could see it, you would all understand and say, oh, how's your dad? But because it's mental, because it's inside his head and you can't see it, you treat him like we're a bit of a strange family, or it's a bit difficult to know who we're with, or I can't explain, but there was a social stigma around it that was very distressing to me as a child. But I look back and realize how much I learned from it. So I'm not whinging about it at all.
Right.
And at the time, however, it meant a great deal to me. And Daddy was ill a few more times. And there was one occasion we would just visit him in the hospital, and it was a psychiatric ward. So even before I was in secondary school, I was used to being in a psychiatric ward. And I kind of grew up very curious, because these people fascinated me. They were lovely. And yes, sometimes they were drugged. So there was a zombiness about it. But that, to me, it was just, that was the hospital I knew when I was a child. And these people were people, same as we were people. They just had a different way of conversing and different permissions. But it was very frightening when my father was in one of his, shall we say, manic phases. It was scary. And then when he was depressed, it was absolutely unbearable. And so I watched that as a child, and I don't know if, I'm sure it did imprint, but it was very beautifully handled. My mother, we met a fabulous psychiatrist who said to my mother, your husband doesn't have a mental illness. This is not a category that makes sense. It's a physiological imbalance of lithium salt in his bloodstream, and your family must accept that and manage with the dosage of lithium salt. He needs to be on it for the rest of his life, but the dosage is dependent on you. And because of my mother's brilliant and healthy attitude, I think, we stayed as a very, very close family, like forever. It wasn't a stigma for us. It was open. It was clear. People are people, and wherever they are is where they are. And that's where our compassion is. And I just bow to her, just getting on with it. And Daddy was well forever. And when he was in his 70s, he, I mean, what I'm saying is it was resolved. It wasn't like an ongoing thing. It was just like, oh, that was when Daddy was ill, and now he's not, sort of thing. Okay. And then he eventually left the industry he was in and became a decorator, and he loved it because he was working with his hands and his body and so on. And then when they retired, Dad was about 76, I think, and he said to me, I think I'm going to hang up my walking shoes, because he used to walk my dog. And he said, I'm 76 now, and it's all downhill from here. And by that time, I'd been a yoga teacher for, don't know how long, but I had been. And I just said, no, Dad, I'm not having any of that. You come to my yoga class. What do you mean? I'm old, I'm not having any of that. Just, and he said, well, your mother doesn't like yoga. And I said, well, I don't care. Why don't you both just come to my yoga class and we'll breathe together? Just sit in the corner, tease me, take the mickey out of me. He's the eternal child, and he's the prankster. And I said, just come. And it got to the point they wouldn't miss it. Every week they were there. And he became my biggest fan. Great. And although we lost him last year at 89, he was doing yoga every week. And when he was 87, my sister had bought him a flight in a Harvard as a birthday gift.
Right, lovely.
And he started having these strange attacks, and we did not know they were angina attacks. We had no idea. And he would sit in the park, and before he panicked, he'd remember not only being trained to handle high altitude sickness in a Harvard as a pilot, young pilot, decades and decades ago, they had to learn how to handle themselves with altitude sickness. He called in his breathing exercises from the yoga class and would just sit in the park, steady his breath, do his yoga breathing, bring himself round. And what would have got other people in an ambulance, my father just thought, oh, I'm just having one of my funny turns, and came home. And it wasn't until they got very close together, and then one happened in his apartment, literally walking from one room to another, that he was rushed into hospital. And he had angina. They didn't know what had happened, but he was decorating my studio at the age of 87. And it was a heart condition. He built himself his own little bypass, and the bypass had backed up because he'd been drilling brick piers in my studio to hang curtains. We found out afterwards, you know how you can put it together retrospectively. Yeah. And basically, cut a long story short, the cardiologist came in and said, oh my God, he needs open heart surgery and a quadruple bypass, but let's start off with a stent to keep him going. And they put the stent in, and his whole heart lit up, and they said all that had happened was that the arteries had deflated, but they hadn't sclerosed, and he recovered. Wonderful. And they were like, what? And I remember the surgeon coming round to see him and saying, ex-fighter pilot, they don't make them like that anymore. Mm-hmm. Which actually inspired my dad. And he did fly in his Harvard, and we have a photograph of him that someone photoshopped of when he was 28 years old in the RAF, and when he was 87 years old, he did not like being at the back of the aircraft, can tell you, but whatever, get over yourself, Dad, you're not allowed at the front. And he flew, and as I told you before, right up to when he passed last year, we think he had a kind of a stomach cancer that just took him over and he was ready to go. But we knew we were in real trouble when he got out of bed one day and fell to the floor. And I found him on the floor and called for the carers immediately in the care home where they volunteered to move to. And the carer said, oh my God, can you raise your leg to check what was broken and what wasn't? And he was just lying there doing yoga on his back, legs up, right angles to the ground. And then he looked at me and he just went, what do they want me to do? Do they want me to do tree pose? What do they want me to do? And they were like, do you know what? And I said, it's okay. He does yoga. And they were like, huh? I can't even tell you, Emma, they couldn't put together. Now, like some people say to me, well, if he was so bloody fit, why did he die? It was his time. I can't do anything about that. He was diagnosed with dementia and he said, I'm not getting like that. I'm going while I have nobility of mind. And he actually virtually made an agreement with me and my sister that it was his time. However, my point is, physically, he did not suffer at all. And he quietly just breathed himself. I mean, I've got a photograph of him on the 7th of May playing Rummy Cup with me, and on the 30th he had quietly slipped away in his sleep.
Oh, such a moving story. And I mean, both very inspiring stories, both yours and your father's, about the benefits of yoga. And I think the thing that always intrigues me so much is the fact that the benefits can be physical and emotional, spiritual.
And mental and spiritual and the whole caboodle. Because of course in the East, the body wasn't ever segregated, and in the West historically, and this is just a quick example, René Descartes, you can read about this in Candace Pert's Molecules of Emotion, and it's in my book in lots of detail in the history chapter. René Descartes did, in order to get permission to dissect living bodies, I beg your pardon, dead bodies, but humans, we'll reframe that, human bodies as opposed to Barbary apes for science.
Right.
He did a turf deal with the Pope to get permission from the church because it was forbidden. And Vesalius had already done some with special dispensation to show that the human body was different to the Barbary apes. But what René Descartes did was a turf deal with the Pope in order to use dead bodies, cadavers, for science. Because up until that point, it wasn't considered necessary to learn anatomy to do surgery. So, you know, we've come a long way in 400 years, but we're still under some of those impressions. But René Descartes' turf deal was very clear, and it's in the West. The church would retain jurisdiction over the invisible forces of the mind, the being, the soul, and the spirit, and the emotions, because they're invisible.
Yes, yes.
And the physical, visible body, the bit that we do all the data about, the bit that we learn the anatomy of, was under the jurisdiction of medicine. So the human being was segregated from the human doing.
Of course. Yeah.
And that rift is what Fascia, the study of fascia and biotensegrity, is seeking to bridge, to bring it back together again. Now, remember, in the East, that segregation wasn't made.
Of course.
So Ayurvedic medicine doesn't have that distinction between body, mind, and being. It's all one manifestation. And what we're looking for is the unification, the yoga, the yoking of mind, body, and being.
Of course.
And what we're doing is filtering that through. And of course, we segregate it into Ida and Pingala, but as you know, when Ida, Pingala are congruent, Shushumna arises, the neutral arises, the third force arises naturally, and that's the same foundation of biotensegrity, and that's what we're trying to bring into yoga. And what I talk about in my book is just a reiteration of having gone all the way around in a great big spiral through Western study back to where we started. The ancient Vedic sages had something, they knew what they were doing, and biotensegrity is deeply,
yes, and that makes
ancient philosophy.
Of course. So let's backtrack a wee bit let's go to your book. And for those who maybe aren't that familiar, if they're new to yoga or maybe haven't really done much yoga, can you just talk about fascia? You've used the term. Can you explain a wee bit more in lay terms that people might get?
Of course. Fascia is connective tissue. So basically what happened, and this is a very, very fast track, is that in traditional anatomical study of cadaveric specimens, once it was allowed, the general modus operandi was, and sorry if anyone's squeamish about this, but this is how we learned to study anatomy, to create surgery, to create medical schools, to create the wonderful work that our medics do to heal us and repair us. And we honor all of that. And that study traditionally was to cut the body open and scrape away this connective tissue that was considered to be what we call inert packaging. Meaning when you buy something from someone and they send it to you in packaging, and there's sometimes that strawy stuff or that fibrous stuff. I know they use pockets of air now, but there was a time when it would have been frazzled paper, you know, strips. What's the word I'm looking for? Shredded strips of paper, that you would pull those out to get to the thing that you bought. You wouldn't think about the shredded paper. And that's kind of pretty much what happened. Now, 200 years ago, a naturalist and anatomist called John Godman actually wrote about the human fasciae, the human fascial system, and he encouraged his students to look at the body as it is and not impose the idea of separate systems and look for those and ignore what they were cutting through for the sake of identifying what they were cutting to.
Right.
And basically, he actually said prophetically, and I quote him in my book, something like, and I'm paraphrasing, "I know of no greater impediment to progress than the initiation of a new idea. It's horrifying, but all things will fall into their place in their time." And he didn't know how prescient he was being, because it would be another 200 years before we woke up to that. Now, 100 years after him, Andrew Taylor Still, the father of osteopathy, also said he knew of no greater hunting ground for disease in the body than the fascial system. Now, what we now are beginning to discover is that the fascia has become a much greater aspect of our understanding. And we also have the measuring tools to see it differently. And we also live in a culture that understands networks. We've all got mobile phones. We've all got, what's your network? Who is your network provider? It's part of our language, Emma, whereas even 10 years ago, you know, I mean, iPhones came in 2007, I think, and nobody knew what a network was. And suddenly internet, bang, everybody's got it. You need it.
Yes.
And so it's like simultaneously our understanding of what's actually in here is we're looking for something different. And what's been discovered is that not only is the fascia the largest organ of the body, it was thought to be the skin, and the largest sensory of the organ of the body was considered to be the retina of the eye.
Okay.
And recent research suggests that the largest sensory organ of the body is in fact the fascia. Now, I've had arguments with my early yoga teachers, not John Stirk, in fact, but others who have frankly taken the mickey out of me on Facebook publicly for saying that I think anatomy is not only an emotional thing, but a sensory thing. Mm-hmm. And one of my teachers wrote on Facebook, "Joe, just because there's nerves in fascia doesn't make it sensory." He subsequently retracted that remark and apologized for it. But the point is, at the time, it goaded me. It goaded me into saying, no, sorry, that's wrong. And I was very upset at the time, but I turned that into the grit in an oyster, and I turned it into a pearl by writing this book, which I was commissioned to do because I'd done the manual therapy and the movement therapy and the anatomy to bring together this idea that this tissue is what we call ubiquitous, which isn't a lay term, but ubiquitous basically means everywhere. Mm-hmm. Now, this everywhere tissue, I worked with him for many years, Tom Myers took from the standard anatomical bits and turned them into anatomical bands. And I was there when we did the first dissection of them. And yes, those bands are there, but they're still cutting up the body in a different way, and they're still linear.
Yes.
And where we're moving to now is, and we tread on the shoulders of these giants to get there, from John Godman, Andrew Taylor Still, Tom Myers, and a lot of other people in the fascia world, that we are now learning that the fascia is part of our volume, our roundedness, and we are round. There are no linear. I mean, your hand, the front and the back of your hand are not separate. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we can look at the front and say that's the superficial front, and we can look at the back and say that's the superficial back, and we can say, well, that's the side and that's the side, then there's the inside, but at no time are they separate. At any point, embryologically, physiologically, they're never separate. And what Biotensegrity is giving us is a map of the whole territory, because it begins and ends in wholeness. Yes. But to go back to what you said about the fascia, what you asked is the big change, and this is why there's so much out there about fascia and people find it hard to put the bits together and make sense of it all. The big change is understanding that it's anything but inert packaging. It's microscopic and it's macroscopic. It's the filaments and tubules, or the microfilaments and microtubules within the cell are made of fascia. The cell wall is made of fascia, and that which holds the cell together, the connecting tissue, is made of fascia, and the in-between is made of fascia. And there's scientific research to back up all those three statements, but we couldn't have made them 10 years ago, because Neil Thies and Rebecca Wells, who are pathologists in New York, who've discovered what they call the interstitium, the in-between, didn't have the facility to measure the in-between. And they now show that even what's inside the liver, what's between the cells, what's in the bile ducts, what's in the lymph system, where everything, the so-called virtual spaces, there's no empty spaces in the body, but the whole fabric of us is basically fascia. So what we have is connective tissue, cells, and the in-between, and they're all made of fascia. And the fascia is sensory.
That was good to ask. How
sensory. And the leap we're going to make now, because this is where your mind's blown, and now we're going to blow it completely. You have in your phone something called haptics. If you look in there, you'll find sounds and haptics. Haptics, haptic awareness, sensory awareness, is your phone knows whether you're touching it with one finger, two fingers, three fingers, moving them, and how you're moving them. That sensory interface is haptic perception. Yeah. And the most recent research, written by somebody called Martin Granwald, is a book called Haptic Perception, I think that's its name. And that's all in the second edition of my book, is that we are every, if you like, cubic millimeter by volume of us has there's much more sensory, what do we call them, receptors than were thought. And that even in something like your tibial nerve, you have 4 times as many sensory nerve fibers than you have motor nerve fibers. Mm-hmm. So that means, for example, there's 4 times as much listening going on as there is action. And one of the reasons I think yoga is so successful, Emma, is that we are actually taught, no, not always, but mostly, to become sensorily aware of ourselves, to self-sense and come in touch. We might not call it our haptic perception, but actually, if you think of it as your mobile phone knowing how many fingers you've got on its screen, you know how many feet you've got on the mat, you know how many limbs you've got on the mat, you know if you're lying on the mat or standing on the mat. Yes. And it's like, oh, I'm a network. I'm as intelligent as my mobile phone. Yep. I'm even more intelligent than my mobile phone. Yep. You invented the mobile phone. Science didn't design us. We designed science. Do not forget that. And do not be dominated by it. You already know. Embryologically, you self-assembled. And so it's like, I was saying this morning, acorns do not go to university to get a PhD in oak tree-ness in order to grow themselves into an oak tree.
Yes.
It's not required. Nor is it required for you to go to embryo school or grown-up school. I mean, did you get a manual when you were born? Did your mother get a manual when you were born?
No,
definitely not. And I know I didn't, and I didn't get one for my son. And I mean, I've got this beautiful 6 foot, nearly 27-year-old who baffles me on a daily basis. And I'm just like, see, I mean, I come up to here on him and I just go, seriously? And he goes, Mom, don't give me any life lessons. I'm like, okay.
Yes, yes.
And I swear he's bringing me up.
Yes.
Because if anything can make us feel stupid in 1 nanosecond, it's a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
And it's like,
yes.
We already self-assembled. And I think our life journey is about optimizing that. And I think that includes and transcends the distinction of physical, mental, emotional. It's beingness. And what I love about yoga is it allows for beingness and doingness. And then when we get to the explanation of the anatomy, I like to think that fascia and biotensegrity give us a philosophy that matches our true anatomy, not the spell we're under, that we're made of biomechanical parts that are made as levers and upright inverted pendulums, because there are no levers in nonlinear biologic forms, and I can demonstrate that.
Yes. Yes, I read that. I was looking at that bit within the book, because I think that is the misconception, isn't it? And the ancient yogis were so clever because they already knew all the awareness, the oneness, the mind and the body, the connection. And we need science almost to verify it, but it's already there.
It's already that way. And this is one of my theme tunes. Your body's already listening. You're already there. You already self-assembled. You already know what you need to know. And let's just stop having this massive, what's the word I'm looking for? Devotion to finding the guru with the answer. I haven't got the answer. I haven't got a clue. But what I can tell you is I've got a map on this expedition that makes some sense of the wholeness. And that wholeness, the geometry of Biotensegrity is all based on this, which is it's called a tensegrity icosahedron, but basically all round things are made like this.
Yes.
So the spell we're under is that we're only compression systems, that we have a spinal column. Now, a column, if you tilt it, collapses. And yet we can all stand in unusual shapes and postures, you know, half moon pose, and our heads don't fall off.
Yeah.
And why is that, do you suppose?
Exactly.
Or I've got photographs of my 6-foot son hanging upside down off a rock climbing, and it's like, hang on a second, there's more than 80 kilos of him, and yet he's hanging off his fingertips and one set of toes because the other foot is looking for the next foothold. And I'm like,
very clever.
Well, there's no way those muscles can hold 80 kilos. Give me a break.
Yeah.
And that sent me, and having a baby and sent me looking for an explanation that made sense when I stopped being afraid of not understanding biomechanics.
Yes. That's
the thing. And this is where I live for encouraging people to believe in themselves. And I think doubt, if you can transform doubt in yourself into healthy curiosity about your narrative or the narrative you've been taught, check it out. I think something very exciting happens. And what I love about yoga is its tolerance. We have so many different styles of yoga, so many different ways of learning it. And I think part of its tolerance is that we can go into it and find our way. And yes, the Vedic sages knew exactly what they were talking about.
And I was going to say, your book, although initially designed for yoga teachers, therapists, but actually even yoga students at the lowest level will get so much from your book, because it literally covers all of these areas that maybe they haven't been exposed to, but should be.
Well, if they can translate it, let's be really honest now. Let's be really upfront. After my book came out, my publishers put out a workshop. And this cracks me up actually when I think about it. And there were 2 people wanted to do the workshop. And I'm not boasting, but I've never had only 2 people want to do a workshop with me. And I was like, that doesn't quite make sense. I mean, I had 5 minutes of, oh my God, I'm a failure. I had no idea what it took to write that book. So, I mean, I was like dead. It was like, okay, I got it wrong. And then I said, hang on a minute, can you send me the flyer that you put out? And what I got was a flyer that was beautifully respectful of my work and my understanding and my intellectual ability to transcribe and explain things and translate things. But it scared the crap out of me. I read it and I just went, I'm not qualified to do that workshop. And my publisher said, and I went, no, let's just get real about this. We're all yoga teachers together. We're all in this together. And I don't know about you, Emma, but historically, there's almost been a thing that if you're just a yoga teacher, you don't know what you're talking about because you probably haven't done the anatomy, or there's, you know, unless you've worked with someone like Leslie Kaminoff or whatever, David Keel, these people, they're the gurus, and we don't really know what we're doing. And yoga teachers are terrified. And I remember when Pete Blackaby brought Serge Grakovetsky over here, and from Canada, very, very dear to me, Serge, and he was in one of the first International Fascia Research, the first International Fascia Research Congress. And he was explaining to us about fascia, because what he said was the idea that we've got mechanically that a hummingbird's wings spin at 100 beats per second, if that was based on muscular energy, the maths would mean it would routinely burst into flames. And the idea that in the gym we lift weights using intra-abdominal pressure, if you do the maths, your clients would explode. And he said, he's in his French accent, he said, so the moral of this story is, if you get your clients, you take the money first. And it was hilarious. And he had a standing ovation, and it's unheard of for a scientist to get a standing ovation. As we owe a huge debt to Serge Grachovetsky. He's still with us, thank God. Brilliant man. And he had back pain and went to 7 surgeons, and they all gave him different reasons. And I think he's an astrophysicist. And he said, in astrophysics, you're not allowed to have 7 different answers to the same question. So he kind of went into the question of how the spine works, and he's completely on board with biotensegrity now, according to Dr. Levin, so yay. But at this point he wasn't. And he was on the phone to me moaning about you yoga teachers and your mad ideas. And I'd written the piece on my book about the spine. And he said, you can't write like that. You can't talk about the spine as an instrument. You can't do this. You can't do that. And he's shouting at me. And I said, Serge, stop it. Just stop it. We're not here to tell you your science. We wouldn't dream of it. There's not one of us with the arrogance or the stupidity to try and tell you your job. We're asking you for help. Could you stop behaving as if you're fighting another scientist for the best theory? Mm-hmm. You know, in scientists, they'd rather share toothbrushes than share their research, because it's their future ticket to their fame. They're not going to get paid unless they, you know, it's a big deal. I said that we're yoga teachers. We're working with people. We're on the ground. We're whispering. Can you give us something to whisper that helps our clients, please?
Yes, good.
And he was like, oh, okay. So what is it that you want? I said, we want to understand. We're listening. Our ears are so big. Mm-hmm. Don't come in angry with us. Don't come in with your, why are you a bunch of idiots? We know we don't know. But could you just imagine that we're sitting there like little sponges and buckets ready to be filled with your wisdom? Could you just translate so we can understand? And we don't speak astrophysics. And God bless him, he did exactly that. He came to Brighton and his slideshows are just fabulous. Wonderful. And then the following IFRC, International Fascia Research Congress, Jaap van der Waal explained his research of a tissue sparing dissection of the human elbow, which basically meant that he took instead of cutting the tissue away to get to the muscles and define them, he took the muscles out of the tissue and discovered it was continuous. So this goes back to answering your question a different way. He found out that the entire tissue matrix of the whole human body is completely continuous, and the muscles are like events within it. So the fascia came first, and muscle protein is within the fascia.
Right, right.
But that turns everything on its head. So those two things, the fact that the fascia is sensory, the fact that the fascia is this is Serge, the dominant organizer and architecture, and the fact that the fascia is completely continuous and under tension at all times, biotensegrity, is what tells us that we have a completely different map and that we're under a spell from our forefathers. Now, you don't go around lightly saying we're under a spell and we're all spellbound by it, but we are. And we're under a spell that this is a 2D lever, which is a 2-dimensional form, an open 2-bar chain. Nothing in your body is open. It's all connected, which means that's the wrong engineering principle anyway. And I get fought on Facebook regularly, like, you can't prove there's no levers. Well, you prove there are any and I'll talk to you. It's become my glib answer, but I can't do anything else. And now I've got loads of colleagues around the world saying the same thing. So it's like, you know what, this is a paradigm shift. Get on the boat. Yeah. And I promise you, within 10 years, probably 5, we will be being told by scientists who got this that we can't know what we're talking about because we're not sufficiently qualified. But at the moment, they're calling us idiots. That's fine. And so we've got this haptic perception, we've got this under tension, and we've got this ubiquitous, it's everywhere. Now, what do we mean by that? And let me just show you an example. When the embryo forms, every single part of us starts as a bud. And the innermost part grows much faster than the outermost part. So effectively, it gets tensioned. Can you see that? Mm-hmm. That's how it works. Right. And limb buds start as paddles. And then these cells in what we call the in-between are pre-programmed by the architecture to do something called cell apoptosis, which is cell suicide. So this is actually 4 spaces in a paddle, not 5 fingers. Yeah. But it's already under tension. See, my bones grew faster than the tissue around them. Yes. So this is already a tensioned tube, pre-tensioned. We call it a pre-stiffened architecture. Mm-hmm. Fascia came first, muscle arose within it. The bone starts as cartilage, and through forces transmitted through it, hardens in response to those forces. So a 6-year-old child begins to have bony pelvis, but up until that time, it's a cartilaginous possibility, potential.
Okay.
Basically, we're made entirely of fascia on a range of stiffness to softness. The softest, if you pick up the skin on the back of your hand, that's the softest, and that's the superficial fascia, and that's like egg white, because it's a liquid crystal matrix.
Okay.
And then the hardest has got something called hydroxyapatite or calcium in it, or minerals, which is bone. But they're all on a spectrum from softness to hardness of a soft tissue architecture, which is all fascia.
Right.
And we're just beginning to get some traction in what I call the scientific world, because my friend and colleague, John Sharkey, who's a clinical anatomist, who's been nicknamed at Dundee University Fascia Man, because his studies of fascia have gone on for years and years and years and decades. And last year, for the first time in history, and this is huge, every country in the world has an association of clinical anatomists, and they teach doctors. And last year, there was, every 5 years, there's a symposium, and all the national anatomy associations come together and form one federation of anatomists. It's a bit like the Olympics, you know, each country comes together every 4 years and we have an Olympics. So it's like the Olympics in the anatomy world, but it predisposes what will be taught in medical school. So it's a slow process. And last summer, the International Federation of Associations of Anatomists, which is the IFAA, invited John Sharkey to apply. You can't get in, you have to apply to speak about fascia. And he called in Professor Carla Stecco and Vladimir Cheremensky, both professors of anatomy, and both Vladimir is the head of the Gunther von Hagens Institute, and several other professors whose names I don't know, I'm very sorry, but it's all there to be found online. And the IFAA agreed to the talk. They all did, they did it together, and they presented on fascia for the first time in history last summer in August in London. And it's very exciting because the association put out a clinical anatomy magazine, and the entire journal, it's not a magazine, sorry, magazine, journal, formal journal. John would, I bet he's laughing if he hears this, God. It's a journal of clinical anatomy, and in it is the whole journal was devoted to fascia for the first time in history. So just as the International Fascia Research Congress is entering, I think it's 6th every 2 years, so 6th one will be next year in Montreal in 2021. Great. So the IFAA has just done its first presentation on fascia.
Great.
So we're getting somewhere.
It's a shift, definitely a shift thing. And I love the way that you do explain quite a deep subject. You know, you're talking about fascia and the explanation you give, and understand what you're talking about with the stocking. These kind of things are really helpful for those who don't know even that much about it. So you're probably a huge influencer, maybe a wee bit of a disruptor in there as well with this.
Oh my God, pioneering. I mean, that's the reluctant pioneer, yes. But what actually came out of the workshop that didn't work was that I just sat there and I thought, how can I simplify this? How can I simplify this? And I created a course called ABC, which is the Anatomy Basic course. Yes. And I did that for a couple of years. People came and I said to them, what do you want? And they said, well, your book's great, but it takes some reading and some dissecting, and it's quite heavy and intellectual. I didn't think I was intellectual, but apparently I am. And I said, okay, what do you want? And they said, can you explain? And then they said, well, can you stop starting on the 5th rung of the ladder? Can you start on the 1st rung? Okay. So actually, one of the things that's developed out of lockdown is Karen Coke-Ness, who has Meadowlark Yoga in Scotland, not in the same region as you.
Yep.
And she's also absolutely brilliant with anatomy, and she's in the process of writing a book about biotensegrity and yoga and anatomy. So she's another absolutely fascinated and devoted pioneer.
Okay.
And her book is going to come out next year. It's called Spiral Bound. Look out for it, especially if you're an Ashtanga yogi, because she has dared, oh my God bless her, I'm more restorative. The yoga she's practiced is Ashtanga and Vinyasa and so on. And so she's talking about the spiral boundness of the fascia as a biotensegral form, which is just beautiful work. and we're very good friends. And I've created ABC, and Karen is coming on now to my ABC course because we work so well together, bringing the classical anatomy and the contemporary anatomy together and making sense of it for people. Because what we don't want to do, Emma, is threaten people that what they learned in anatomy was a waste of time, because it wasn't.
I know.
What you learned is the map. And what we want to do is hold your hand and take you into the territory so that it makes sense. And then you can explore anything, you know, whether you're on the map or in the territory, and they're different.
Good.
And they're distinctions that we need to do this journey. And then I personally take it into understanding the fascia as a tissue that manages time in the body. It stores our history. It responds in present time, but it also anticipates what hasn't happened yet. And that aspect is slightly more, should we say, mystical, philosophical, but again, it's deep to the yogic sutras and philosophy, and we start making sense of it as living beings.
Great.
And it's a very exciting field to be in. Yoga is so forgiving and broad-shouldered, and I'm passionate about it, obviously.
I can tell, yes, absolutely. So not that I want to link yoga, you're mentioning yoga styles there. One of the questions that I wanted to ask you was the prevalence of yoga injuries within the yoga world. So we often find that many people are drawn to a particular style of yoga,
Yep.
But it's not necessarily a style that suits them in a mental capacity, a spiritual way, and a physical way, but they're drawn to it for other reasons. And you mention in your book that you can look at yoga and posture profiling, archetypal movement patterns, and the gunas within our ancient scriptures. Can you explain a bit more about mapping students? I think you talk of it as mapping, and how understanding yourself as a person, as a whole person, how maybe you as a student can guide yourself into a more appropriate style, or a teacher who can maybe guide their student in an appropriate way within their style. Say if they're very sort of A-class personality in an Ashtanga class, that they maybe, as you talked about earlier, maybe teach them through John Stirk is to slow down. And
absolutely,
Ashtanga, they don't have to do it on that full-on competitive environment. Is there more that you could tell us about that, either from the book or your experience?
Well, both. I mean, what was in the book is purely from my experience, because I didn't learn this anywhere, but I brought together lots of bits that I learned in other places, if that makes sense, and tried to make sense of it in the physical. But basically, to drill it down to something that we can speak verbally without images, and just make sense of. We are multi-dimensional beings. So the idea that all we've got is a nervous system, that you touch something and a message goes to your brain, and then from your brain back to your finger to do something, that actually takes too long for the speed at which we can respond. And that's all measurable. And we know that when you're on a motorbike with your visor up and a fly hits your eye, you're likely to shut your eye before the fly hits your eye. And that's many times faster than the nervous system works. Now, that doesn't mean the map of the nervous system is wrong. It means it's not the only explanation for responsiveness. Mm-hmm. So what we have is this reflexive system that is very self-aware. And we know by default that we're somehow tuning that on the yoga mat, even if we don't have the right explanations for why. Now, and I will answer your question, I promise. When you see that, what I showed you just then as your hand in that glove or that sock that is pre-tensioned, like a tent is tensioned, when you cut the canvas on a tent, it opens into we call it a mandala shape, an almond shape. It doesn't just leave as a slit. And the same is true of your skin. It's your skin is already your sealed neoprene wetsuit. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what pre-tensioned means. So you are inside, we could call it a baby grow. And it might be a very soggy baby grow and very soft, lax tissue like mine that folds in half in all directions without batting an eyelid. I don't even need to push my hands to fold them in half backwards. It's a nightmare sometimes.
Yes.
Or you might be somebody that says, oh, I'm very stiff. Now, this is where our language comes into play, and we start having to really change things. This is a model that is identical to this one, but this one is lax. These are Manhattan toys for anybody that's listening to this as a podcast and not seeing it. These are Biotensegrity icosahedrons from the Manhattan toy company that Tom Flemons designs. They're called squishes. And one of them's been squished and pulled and pushed and goodness knows whatted, and it's formed a laxity in the tissue. And one of them is stiffened so that when I deform it, it reforms on its own, because it's a tension compression architecture, not a compression architecture. And that's what we are. But what we have to have is sufficient stiffness to hold ourselves up. And unfortunately, people think stiffness is a pathology. Oh my God, my shoulder is so stiff. Can you help me mend it? But what I'm bringing into this conversation is the idea that my hands is so soft that when I wanted to learn structural integration, the hard part for me was teaching my hand to stiffen sufficiently so that I could make the changes in someone else's tissue that were required without bending my hand so badly that they became like this model that is too lax. So in other words, if you stretch a hypermobile body, it will feel drained and exhausted, because it's like taking a soggy matrix and making it soggier. You need to stiffen it. But if someone's got a very stiff matrix, you need to soften it. So what that does is it says, let's just look at this from a multi-dimensional view. There is no right, wrong. There is only appropriate to me. And appropriate has the Latin proprio in it, meaning one's own self. One's own self. Aproprio means one's own selfness, one's own self-awareness, if you like. The fascia system is called our organ of proprioception, same root, one's self-perception. So what we're bringing in here now, we've got three things. We've got the architecture, we've got the perception of the architecture, and we've got the tissue of the architecture. Yeah? So let's say in the middle of the wheel, the center, the hub of the wheel, we would call that the mesomorph, the middle shape. That's what that means. Meso is middle and morph is shape. So the mesomorph is right in the middle. Now on the vertical scale, yes, we go up, we've got ectomorph above and endomorph below. And that means ectomorph means very staccato, very neurologically based, and more on the outside. So very aware of what's going on the outside, and ba, 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 ba. We think of staccato, we think of a little squirrel munching a nut and looking all around it to see what's going on. That's ectomorphic, or a little mouse. Not because it's little, but because it's like a meerkat watching all the time and looking outward.
Yeah.
And then we go all the way straight down to the endomorph, which is more chilled, more, we're thinking less of a highly strung person and more of a, you might call it a couch potato, somebody who's laid back. Now they are neither is less sensitive. That would be a mistake. That's why in the book I say it's a very soft graph. Don't start telling me one's sensitive and one isn't. One is outwardly focused and one is more, maybe more placid, maybe more inwardly focused, but nonetheless sensitive. Don't make that mistake. And one's not thin and the other fat, but what tends to happen is the ectomorph tends towards burning nervous energy and the endomorph tends to chilling out.
Yeah.
And then we have the horizontal graph. So left of center, your left, my right, but whatever which way around it is, we've got the Viking to jungle on the horizontal scale of the fascia. So the Viking tends to be the stiff, large, powerful, brute force, handles cold temperatures. Think Viking with a piece of fur around him, marching through the mountain with his family on his back, and if there's a boulder in the way, just kicks it or moves it. That and can stand cold temperatures. These aren't all necessarily true of all Vikings, but let's go there. The other end of that horizontal scale is the jungle bunny, I call it. So that would be me, the really soft, mobile, sinewy. I couldn't move those two rocks out the way. I'd have to wind my way around them or between them.
Yes.
So we think of that as a very quiet, sinewy body and more ninja-y if it's well trained. I'm not describing myself as a ninja. I'm just saying I'm soft and soggy and I can't stand cold temperatures. So the Viking, however, is strong, brute force, muscle bound and towards stiffness. And we all live somewhere on the circle around those four coordinates. And these soft maps are designed first to find out where your client sits.
Yes.
And secondly, to move them towards the center. And this is the bit where people get like, Because if the Viking is right at the Viking end of the scale, to move them towards the center, you want them to do more softening, stretchy things. So we've got another map of the practices. The fast power yoga is at the top, the slow meditative practice is at the bottom, the very the power yoga, if you like, the strength-based yoga is the performance, is the Viking, and the sinewy, soft yin practice-ish, but I hesitate with the words because people interpret them so differently, is at the other end. So what you're saying is that somebody like me would do better to, I'm in the top right hand corner, so I tend towards nervous energy. I tend to A-type personality, get out there and make it happen and do it quickly, but I also am very sinewy. So what I had to do was slow down to bring me down to the center line, so more meditation, and then stiffen up.
Yeah.
And that is like telling a yogi in some classes, they look at you like you call yourself a yoga teacher and you're telling me to stiffen up, but I'm here to stretch. I can fold it up. No. Stretch is the S word in my world.
Yeah.
Let's get you to the center. We need to stiffen you up. And you try telling a Viking that they need to be in a yoga class when actually what they're doing is pumping iron in the gym and very proud of it. That's a mindset change.
It's a light bulb thing, that. I mean, I think even from a teacher's point of view, that's just amazing to know that, because you see all these people within your class, and I think we have a few parallels. I'm probably in the same corner as you. I don't have mobility like you do, but I definitely have hypermobility joints. And I also injured my back with children and ended up going into yoga to help. But I did stay within the Vinyasa Ashtanga type world for a long time, taught a lot of Vinyasa, and I actually did my back in to the point where I had to stop teaching for a while. And so I realized from your chart that I had to move over to the stiffening side, and I actually find Iyengar extremely useful for me because there's so much strength in it, holding postures for longer. And it's not that I teach that, but I understand that from my own practice, and it's trying to bring that into a class when you are a teacher, when you are an Ashtanga teacher, or when you're a Yin teacher, that it's not, as always, not one fits all.
It's never one fits all. And this is the thing, this is my favorite aspect of working with the fascial matrix, because this is physical, physiological, and what we could call psychosomatic, in psyche being soul and soma being body. And that is that morphology is archetypal. So what we've just done is a really fast track. I mean, I take hours, days to teach this, but the archetypal nature of what I call posture profiles is that our morphology is archetypal, which means we have everyone, even if you've got the same archetypes, as you've so beautifully said, Emma, you and I have got a similar fascial archetype, but of course our lives are different. You've got 2 kids, I've got 1. You teach all the time. I tend to be lecturing and sitting a lot, because now lecturing means sitting on Zoom. And so I've had to adjust my practice accordingly. And, and then it's meditation. How long do you want to sit in meditation before you kind of feel like you're atrophying? And all these things are this fine balance, and it changes day by day.
Yes. Yes.
So that aspect of it is one thing, but the other part of it is that our being, if you like, is archetypal. So obviously I have the archetype of the storyteller. You can hear it, and I'm very lucky I studied with Carolyn Mace for several years in Chicago in person, studying archetypes. And when that light bulb went on for me in human archetypal patterns, then I started, I was really in a pickle for a while, because I started thinking, oh my God, my own archetypes have different morphologies. I have the pioneer archetype, whether I like it or not. I remember having a conversation with Carolyn saying, is the archetype of the reluctant pioneer a thing? And she just went, oh, honey, I'm right with you. And I said, I don't even want it. Could somebody else have it? She said, you agreed, honey.
That's your purpose.
And she said, I said, if I write a book called The Reluctant Pioneer, will you write the foreword? She went, I'm right with you, honey. It's like, I took on that job this lifetime, and guess what? And so anyway, it's another whole thing. But the point I'm making is the pioneer is this very strong, very capable, very out there person who uses the stories to make things happen. But the artist in me is tiny like a child, and just wants to hide behind everybody and just go, I just paint a picture. And in the first edition of my book, all my images, as you know, they're all pink. Oh God, I nearly had a nervous breakdown when I saw it. anyhow, fortunately, the second edition's in color. And even that was like, I didn't have time to redo them all, but some of them, most of them. And it was like, okay, which archetype is going to make the most difference? And there again, you know, which practice will make the most difference to me today? And what it's actually taught me, Emma, is that the wisdom that we don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going on. And the only way I make my own world work is I literally get up in the morning and I think to myself, okay, what's today about? Who am I bringing to the mat today? What can I do for the highest good today? And in this heat, not a lot.
Yes, exactly.
And so we learn to adjust and listen appropriately at the time. So what I hope the book does is provide people with like an overall view, and that builds their confidence, because you start seeing results really quickly when you say to somebody, the reason you're not enjoying my yoga class is because you're already hypermobile and we're just making lax tissue laxer. Can I recommend that you go to an if a style class is more appropriate, and that person falls in love with you for helping them do what they needed to do? And it may be a subtle ratio change, Emma. For me, what it was I needed to do a little bit of weight training and resistance work twice a week and my yoga practice once a week. And then I found that those 3 sessions of intensive work were perfectly balancing me so that I could do my meditation, which is the biggest deal in the whole world to me and always has been since I was a teenager, that I could do that without getting backache. And then I discovered that if I added a daily walk to that for 20 to 40 minutes, I could actually make it all work. And it was a really subtle mix. And I think the fascial matrix, when you start understanding its multidimensionality, you start giving yourself permission to be different each day a little bit, and to work with much more subtle distinctions, and to forgive yourself for more. And I think we kind of can stop beating ourselves up, because, and this is where the mental thing comes in, if you are in an Ashtanga class and you are told that you would be good at it if you could, and I've seen this many, many times on my bodywork table. I'm not picking on Ashtanga. I've got the same issue with Scaravelli was my matriarch, and I've seen the same problem with that in reverse, different. But I've had people come to me devoted to Ashtanga who've done series 1 for years because their teachers told them they're not ready for the second series. And they've done forward flexion till they're humble enough and da-da-da-da-da. And basically what they've come to me with after a year is a repetitive strain injury.
Yes, and that's where the injuries are coming in, isn't it? Yeah.
And it's like, hang on a second, from a fascial point of view, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, and they come to me, no, hour and a half every single day, or else I'm, fascia doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. And there's no, let's go back to the Vedic sages. They would do this and a bit of this and pulling and da-da-da-da, so that they could sit. And yoga was about moving from speed to stillness. And then it was designed in certain ways for the Western body, because we are so intellectually oriented that we needed to do something physical to quieten the mind drama, the the chitta vritti. And then we've now designated this yoga from this yoga, from this yoga, from this yoga. And it's no longer the yoga of your body type, because you would have had a one-to-one teacher guiding you in that. And this is where the gunas come in.
Yes.
And where the types, the Ayurvedic types come in.
Yep.
And so we're just going back to what was already written. It's not like I invented it. It's just that posture profiling was something I've distinguished from my training in archetypes and my training in fascia. And I put it together and just sat there with my very dear friend Linda Dantel, who Treehouse Yoga London she's just brilliant. And we just sat together, and I suddenly went, it's like a butterfly. She said, what do you mean? I said, there's the dark chrysalis, and then there's the emergence, and the caterpillar, and to the butterfly, and it's the gunas, and the blah, 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 all the stuff I write. And I was like, hang on a minute, we're not the same, and we're multidimensional. And some days, like when I lost my dad last year, my yoga practice changed completely. I sat in my chair and sobbed.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what I needed to do.
Yes.
And then I did 21 trips last year, Emma. So I wasn't in the same country for more than 2 weeks. And around my father's death, I was looking at my phone. I was thinking, what? My phone's muddled up my photographs because I was in 7 different cities in 6 weeks.
Yes. Yes.
10 weeks, 8 cities, 10 weeks, something like that. And I just looked at it, I was like, what? Mm-hmm. And now we're I've been in isolation pretty much since February, March. And it's like, oh.
Yes.
I didn't know that I needed stillness. I mean, intellectually, yes. And this is my point. I think sometimes we study yoga intellectually and we do what we think we ought to do. And actually the body's going, this isn't working for me. This isn't working for me. Hello, this isn't working for me. And then eventually we start believing in ourselves enough to say to let's say we've got a basic self, that the conscious self is saying, yes, but you don't understand. My teacher's told me, and I've got to do series 1 for if it's that example, or I've got to do this softening and this lengthening, and it's just making me tired, and I don't understand why, but I love my teacher, and she's right, and she's clever. And it's like giving the responsibility out there, when in fact we're being encouraged to bring it in here and check it out for ourselves. And your body, if you know what you're listening for, will tell you very clearly what you need, and it might not be the same thing every day.
Yes, exactly. So we're back to awareness again, aren't we?
Awareness and balance. And what do we learn in yoga? Well, there's the yang and that's Chinese, the yin yang, but it's part of the flower of life. It's the same pattern, and it's just different Eastern philosophies, but they're same but different. Let's put it like that. And we've got Ida, Pingala. But Ida doesn't work alone, and Pingala doesn't work alone. And when they're beautifully united, Sushumna arises spontaneously. That's all we're looking for, is that balance. And so we're back to the Vedic sages again.
Absolutely. Fascinating stuff. Now, you're going to be a pioneer again, even though you reluctantly want to be, because we've started our new section of asking our listeners to give a question to our guest, and you're the first one. So,
cool. What are you going to, just so they know, whoever they are, if they're listening, I haven't got a clue what these questions are, so go for it. You have time to prepare.
Nicola on Facebook, she is a soft tissue therapist.
Yep.
I'd like to know if Yin Yoga would be the best style of yoga to recommend to clients for helping to release fascia and not just the muscle. Is that something that you would concur with or not?
What a great, juicy question. Well, I would love to have a chat with her about release, because when you're working from a biotensegrity point of view, everything's whole and complete. So releasing one thing is changing shape with another. Nothing happens on its own, right? Mm-hmm. So we've got a Hoberman sphere here. I don't know if everybody can watch it, but if you release one bit, you're shape changing another bit, because it's one piece.
Yes. Yeah.
That's not what most people are taught in soft tissue release anyway. And we do have this idea that if you release a myofascial trigger point, or you structurally integrate, that you are releasing. People have a feeling of release. What actually there is a component. If you imagine you're wearing a baby grow, and I'm going to do it with my t-shirt, and you pull between your finger and thumb a piece of t-shirt and you twist it, that would be something like how a myofascial trigger point behaves and looks under a microscope or in a cadaveric specimen. You wouldn't see it this obviously, this is microscopic, but no. And that might be an adhesion, it might be a trigger point, it might be a torn muscle that's in spasm. But what I'm trying to say is, can you see that it's affecting my t-shirt far other places than where I've actually twisted it?
Yep.
So it may be that the release is required, the message is over here, and the release is required distal from the message. In other words, the pain in your shoulder might be caused by your appendix scar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So given that person questioning that knows that, because if she's a soft tissue therapist, she absolutely has experience of working on someone's foot and their lumbar spine changes, because it's all one piece.
Yep.
Yin Yoga is, Paul Crilly came up with the name Yin Yoga, and so making a Chinese distinction between yin and yang.
Yeah.
It's very congruent with restorative yoga, the way Vanda Scaravelli works. I'm not saying they are one or each other, but we've got to work out a difference between marketing and where we're coming from. So the work of Yin Yoga, what I think Paul Crilly did, one of many things, I think he's brilliant, is that he legitimized a softer approach for yoga with that lovely neutral name as Yin Yoga, balancing Yang Yoga, whatever you put in whichever category. And Jo Fee is a very dear friend of mine, and she is one of the key pioneers of Yin Yoga around the world. And of course, it's fabulous because she talks about yin inspiration and go yin side, but it's just brilliant. And it is remember, it is a Chinese oriented way of working with the wholeness, as distinct from an Ayurvedic way. But what we're doing is we're juxtaposing one methodology over another, in that the ancient mystery schools is all same but different. Yes. So Yin Yoga in that context is a softer approach, and I would say it's body appropriate. So I am a teacher of structural integration. If I get structurally integrated by somebody that doesn't understand I'm hypermobile, I am in serious trouble. I get off the table, I can't walk. And if I'm on a yoga mat doing too much bendy-wendy yoga, folding myself in half because I can't walk for a week. I had to learn that. I have to hold postures and pull myself in and consciously draw in and appropriately balance the tension compression matrix for myself. So my resistance to Nicola's question is only that, yes, if they're that kind of person, and no, if they're not. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. If you hold for longer, which is the yin way, that reaches the fascia more efficiently than the faster. No.
If you hold for longer, and you may be, understand me, I love yin. I love the whole approach, as I love all forms of yoga, and I've done most of them for a period of time, including Bikram. And really the essence of what I'm saying is horses for courses. The right yoga or the right dosage, it's like making a dish. If you put too much of one herb and not enough in the other, you don't have an overall flavor. That herb, that flavor over disturbs the rest of the dish. And Indian food is a fabulous and classic example of that, you know, where in one part of India, it's all garlic and ginger, and another part of India, they don't use garlic and ginger at all. It's tomatoes, and, you know, it's a balance. And I had a friend who was, he was amazing, and he used to cook, and he would, I can't even tell you, and it's that. So you're kind of cooking. So I would say, yes, if that person is responding to soft tissue release, and one of the things you want to do is bring them into more conscious focus on themselves. I mean, there's a part of me that agrees with Bikram's idea of having a yoga school on every corner just to get us all moving.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I don't agree with the yogic style. I had the first Bikram school in my studio here. I wasn't running it, somebody else was. And part of me was completely bloody horrified at this heating the body up and not doing proper anatomy and blah, blah, blah. But on the other half, I was just thinking, well, you know what? Everybody's out there doing their hour of yoga every day, for at least they're moving.
Yeah, exactly.
And for some people, it was brilliant.
Exactly.
Now, that we're not talking about all the historical stuff about abuse and yoga. But what I am thrilled to hear you ask me about is injury, because there was a time 10, 20 years ago when everybody behaved as if there was no such thing as injury in yoga.
Yeah.
Of course there is, because some people don't know what they're doing. Not every yoga teacher is as conscientious as you are. You know, some people think it's just about stretching, lengthening, getting yourself twisted and folded, and you're done.
Exactly.
And what I would also say is I know some fantastic Ashtanga teachers who can gently encourage people like you and me into these, what we might call harder poses, and we can find them.
Yes.
Because they know what they're doing. So hard and fast rules, it's a unique combination between teacher and client. I would say what I love about Nicola's question is that it's one-to-one, and she's asking it, which means she's really dedicated to finding out what would actually work for that person. And sometimes tensioning the tissue, holding a pose for a long time, will draw in their ability to engage and stiffen, because they need that appropriately. And sometimes it will just agitate their nervous system. So it's a bit more subtle than that, but I would say yes and no, depending on the client's body type.
So back to that individual idea of each thing. And then the second one is from Pam on Facebook, and she says, is collagen and fascia the same thing? I think we've covered the fascia aspect, but is it the same thing? And do hypermobile people have more fascia than most?
Such a great question. They're great questions. Fascia is made of collagen, reticulin, and elastin.
Right.
So reticulin is baby collagen, and the balance of collagen and elastin is misconstrued to mean if you've got lots of elastin, you're elasticy, and if you've got lots of collagen, you're stiff. Not true. Yeah. Elastin is capable of elongating to, I think it's 105% of its length. That might not be accurate, but something like that. And collagen only lengthens 5%. So collagen is designed to hold us together. And elastin is something that the body calls on in wound healing. So if the body is opened, the elastin will be part of the mending and repair process to bridge a gap in a scar, for example. But there's an awful lot that's not known about fascia yet. But what I will say, and I'm not going to go into it, is that collagen has several types. They're designated different types. Mm-hmm. So all fascia has collagen in it. Not all collagen expresses as fascia. Okay. Maybe you couldn't, I don't know if you can say that actually. I don't know if you can say that. It's complex. And what's happening, there's massive arguments within the science, just so everybody knows, this isn't me being a moron. It's that there's collagen type 1, collagen type 2, collagen type 3, they're different type fibers. And there's argument as to whether you can say that bone is fascia, because bone is made of, I mean, the whole body's made of fascia, it's all fascia. And then what happens is the cartilage, which has just fascia with a lot of hyaline in it, and the muscle is fascia with a lot of muscle protein and a lot of that particular collagen type. So muscle fiber is fascia of a particular collagen type. So they have a different density, a different thickness. Ligament and tendon. So a tendon can be like a tube of fascia, but it can also be something called an aponeurosis, which is like a sheet of fascia. It's all fascia. And the bone, as it hardens through force transmission, lays down hydroxyapatite, so it's fascia with hyaline and mineral in it. And it hardens, but it's on a scale of soft matter. And we've been, just to be really clear about all this, we've been trained in anatomy, physiology, and biomechanics as if we're made of hard matter, like a table or a house. And we're made of soft matter. So the rules are different. And what we are learning are the soft matter rules that make sense of how the fascia already is. So different types of collagen respond under different circumstances and are organized with different substances to manifest as different architectures in the body. So the architecture of a ligament is different to the architecture of a tendon, is different to the architecture of a bone. I think that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's great. Well, thank you very much for being our first guest to do that. It's been hugely beneficial. I'm sure they'll love their answers. And I have kept you more than, I know your time is very valuable. So a quick teacher's tip. If you had to give one major teacher's tip, what would you give?
Okay, you do an exercise with me. We'll do it together. Yeah? Really simple. Okay. So just find yourself a really comfortable sitting position and be on your anterior pelvis, so your sitting bones, and rock slightly towards your pubic bone, so your tailbone's behind you. Yep. So in other words, if you do the opposite and tuck your tail under, yep, would be like a dog with a tail between its legs. I'm not calling you a dog, but you know what I mean, that movement. Whereas what we want is that the tail's behind us.
Yes.
And with that, there you go, on your sitting bones. And your feet are on the floor. So you've got 6 feet on the floor, the 4 feet of your chair and the 2 feet of you.
Yeah.
You're lovely and grounded. And then just roll your shoulders, drop your shoulder blades down and towards each other. Let the collarbones settle over the thorax. And just imagine the crown of the head lifting out from your sitting bones and your feet. Just a little touch into the heels of your feet, the heels of your torso, as it were, your sitting bones, and push your crown up. There's a feeling of length, and then settle back. So you lovely breathing, sitting posture. So just to start with, I want you to imagine that you're breathing, just using all your breathing muscles. So you just inhale and exhale. nice and simple.
Yeah.
And just rest the tongue in the roof of the mouth, and imagine that your inhalation is an expansion with all your breathing muscles and all your secondary respiratory muscles and all the posh names we've got for all that in your intellectual center. If you can remember what they are, don't worry about it. And exhale. And that's, if we talk somebody through that in that way, is what I would call an intellectual process of breathing that we learn when we get out our anatomy books and we learn our breathing muscles and blah, blah, blah. But in actual real time, we just experience the movement. And now we're going to shift into a different way, and we're going to do something ever so slightly different. We're going to imagine that we don't breathe ourselves. We are breathed by life force, by nature. And that has a different quality. That is imagining that the tree is exhaling and life is breathing you, because you can kill yourself, but you can't suffocate yourself. You don't have that power. So let's imagine that respiration is respirating, and that the spirit that animates our form, our fascia, our architecture, that's it, that's you, is breathing you. So soften down into that breath, widen your feet, widen your sitting bones, soften and widen your shoulders, rest your tongue on the roof of your mouth, and just wait and receive the breath. And when it's ready, it will come in. And as you receive the breath, just allow it through your imagination just to be bringing in light, love, and the sound of life itself into your body through every membrane of your fascial matrix, which is everywhere. And imagine that lovely golden liquid light moving through every single part of you. As you inhale, just fill yourself up with that. And imagine it scooping up any negativity, any dis-ease, discomfort, anything you don't need. And then as you exhale, just let all of that go with it. Let it go with the breath and give the breath back. Just give it back into the nothingness from which it came. And imagine it's being transformed because the trees are inhaling it. And they're letting go. And as they let go, the breath hovers and you receive the breath. And imagine you're receiving grace. The grace of life itself, the grace of your anima animus. Ida Pingala. Shushumna arises just as the joy of life. And receive the breath. And let it gather anything that's not for your highest good. And let it go.
Thank you. And that just takes all the effort away. And it gives you that connection with the mental health that we haven't touched on nearly enough today. And we haven't touched on the breath enough today. We've got so much we could talk about, but we're probably nearing the end of today. So is there anything that really that you feel you want to cover that we haven't covered today that you want to put into this?
Just that we're beings, animating bodies, not bodies that will, when we get it right, we can be who we want to be. We already are. And what for me, the fascia for me, is the interface, the pattern of the matter of us animated by spirit. And pattern comes from pater, matter comes from mater. And the father, mother, spirit, if you will, the third force, is the Ida Pingala and the Shushumna arising. We are already that. And I think that the fascia is this subtle interface of our awareness, that we bring in that awareness and feed it back into our form, and then we let it go and radiate as our radiance. And that actually I think we can share that with everybody just by being in that grace and sharing that grace as the breath, because we can't control that. We can a little, but not a lot. And that just by doing that, we change the rhythm that we live in, and we make massive difference. I've seen it in my father for decades. I've seen it in myself. I can calm myself down just by the breath. And sometimes I hum. There's lots of research on the value of humming. And if I get my breath is, and I'm asthmatic and I've had pneumonia, I just go, oh, hang on a minute. And to hum, you have to inhale. And then we can change everything. And I think we have more power than we think, but it's very subtle, and that we just have to kind of come home a bit.
Absolutely, that's wonderful. And I, as a young person, suffered a bit from panic attacks, and I wish I'd known what I know now from my yoga training, that would have been my light out of it much quicker than it did all those years ago. So it's been absolutely, I can't say how fascinating it has been. I could talk to you all day long.
And I'd love to come back. I mean, we've got lots to talk about, I'm sure. That's not me inviting myself. I'm fascinated by what you're doing. I think it's such a contribution to the community.
I just really want people to find such expert knowledge of everything that you've talked about. And I think we will have to do another one again, that's for sure. They can find you all on social media. They can find you on your website, just under your name, Joanne Avison. Yeah. I presume they can drop your line on social media if they feel they want.
Of course. And my personal Facebook and Instagram pages are my full name, Joanne Sarah Avison, and my business ones are Joanne Avison, and both are alive and well. I mean, you just get pictures of my family on my personal one and my garden. And but it's a fascinating world. I've got some fabulous colleagues, and it would be so much fun. And in fact, when I'm hoping we'll be able to do a dissection next year in Dundee with John Sharkey, and if that's the case, we'll let you know. And
yes,
yeah, John is an asset. I mean, oh my goodness, just watch this space, and perhaps I can arrange for you to talk to him. He's not formally a yoga teacher, but he's worked with Lisa, what's your surname in Dublin? I can't think. Anyway, I'll write to you, and then you can invite them on and him on and do that, because it's
wonderful. That would be great. And your passion for this comes out in bucket loads. You are so about it all, and it's a wonderful thing that you're doing as well. Your work is incredible, and the fascia world, so the therapists are all going to love you too. So you've got double whammy of yoga world and the fascia world as well.
Well, it's quite a responsibility, actually, but I cannot tell you how much I appreciate. We need more people out there appreciating this stuff and getting it out there, and so that's why we're not precious about it, why we share it so much. And that's why I'm so proud to be working with Karen Kirkness at Meadowlark Yoga in Scotland, and the work she's doing, and her book Spiral Bound, and Handspring Publishing actually are in East Lothian, and they've got books on biotensegrity, all my colleagues in the biotensegrity field, and there's a wealth of knowledge. We've just done some work with Jan Trewartha, who's head of the British Fascia Symposium. She's the director of that programme, and she's a specialist in scar tissue, and all of us have contributed to her book with Sharon Wheeler on scar tissue. So anybody out there who's a soft tissue specialist, please go to Handspring Publishing Limited, handspringpublishing.com, I think.
Yes, yeah.
And you'll find lots of interesting stuff to get in up to your neck, and you'll just
love it.
Changing the world one person at a time, but I think it's the way of the future.
Great. Well, namaste, and thank you.
Namaste. And thank you for your work, Emma. It's brilliant.
I thoroughly enjoyed myself. Thank you.
Me too.
Thanks for tuning in to Voices of Yoga, and we hope you feel inspired. You can find more of our free podcasts at www.voicesofyoga.com, and we are on all the main podcast platforms too. We are very open to comments and suggestions, so if you'd like to also leave us a review on iTunes, that would be fantastic. If you would like to know when the most recent podcast is going to be broadcast, you can sign up to our newsletter on the website, and we will drop you an email with that recent update. Voices of Yoga is our passion project, and if you like what we're doing and you would like to support us, it would be very much appreciated. And you can do that through a very small donation on our website on the donation button if you feel so inclined. If you would like to collaborate with us in terms of sponsorship, advertising, or even suggest coming on and being a guest, then please drop us an email at voicesofyoga@mail.com. So thanks again, and we look forward to bringing you another inspiring yoga story next week. Namaste.